Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Integrity Matters by Turnitin. My name is Chooks, and today we're going to be exploring the future of assessment, trying to establish what's going on in the assessment landscape. And with me in the house today is Tony Maguire from D2L. Tony, can we get to know you and give us a little bit about your academic and research background and also your professional background, and particularly what excites you about the work you do at D2L?
Thanks, Chip, and it's great to be joining you today. Um, I started using Apple IIe's back in the 80s when I was teaching primary school. So I guess education and technology, that kind of nexus point, has been something that's intrigued me and I found quite exciting over many, many years. Even teaching, I had the opportunity to work for companies like Oracle, working with education departments, schools, universities, TAFEs along the journey. So it's been a fairly checkered kind of uh, journey to this point. Over the last probably 4 years, I was doing a lot of consultancy work before I took this role with D2L. I was doing commission work for some of the universities around online learning, migration, innovation and technology transitions. So I guess the most interesting thing for me is the way in which learners can be supported by technology and the way in which it actually helps them deliver on the outcomes they're seeking. We quite often get tied up on what's going to be the benefits to the university, or what will be the benefit to the academics. And it's great to be able to lower academic burden and decrease, effort. That's really important. But at the end of the day, have we actually provided something which has given the student a sense of agency and control? Have they actually benefited from it? And is their future and their understanding of where they want to go more accurately defined and achievable for them?
Thanks for the introduction there. As we're exploring assessment, just trying to get a sense of from you, what are some trends and use cases you're seeing in how we design assessment as particularly authentic assessment? You could talk from the higher ed and the vet space. I
Mm.
think you've got experience in both areas.
I might use an opportunity to just reference a webinar that I was on this Wednesday. So on that webinar, we had thought leaders from TAFE New South Wales. We had the Chief Academic Officer and CEO of Queensland TAFE on the line, and we also had a number of other academics. And we talked about micro-credentials. And I use micro-credentials because it is a trigger to think about things like more authentic approaches to assessment, but more specifically, how do you think about the content you're creating, the learning activities that you use to develop those competencies, those conceptualizations, whether it's competency-based or time-based, and then how do you assess? So that was an interesting conversation. And what we were looking at there was groups, educational organizations who are trying to do this at scale.
Mhm.
And one of the examples we had that was discussed by Janet Pine, who was the chief learning for TAFE Queensland, was around their COVID safe content that we helped them build out. They had to deliver it in 2 weeks. We built this additional system for them, and they rolled it out, and so far over 200,000 people have taken our course. It continues to be a very significant part of what they provide in terms of broader services. But apart from that, there's also about 120,000 plus learners who go through their undergraduate programs and short courses. So that mix of content, that mix of products, if you like, because we need to think about not just our undergraduate and postgraduate approaches to more traditional credentials, but we have to think in terms of products now. How do we start to weave in a more complex set of products that students need or require across their entire learning journey? And then how do you start to map assessments and artifacts back from those that provide robustness to the assessment? It provides a good sense of what the student can. And then how do we help the student bubble up that information that achieved in a way that they can use in their professional or learning journey, if it's a job they want to go for. So it was interesting to hear the way in which these different groups were thinking about VR and Sims, but also intermediate kinds of technologies like H5P that have been around for a while, and how we've worked with Queensland TAFE, for instance, to open up the back end of our APIs so that they can think about a more expansive approach to the tools they want to use for assessment. So instead of being tied to the toolset that they just use within a particular LMS, how do we think about it in more of an ecosystem approach? So authentic assessment, broader sets of tools, taking that ecosystem approach where we have to play nice in the sandpit, which is a whole variety of tools. If I then go back to the higher education piece more specifically, the H5P has been an interesting journey for us with Victoria University. We invested in some local development work to help them with their H5P usage across a whole variety of programs. And you're probably aware that they use the block method there. This brings us to assessment and then student expectations and academic workload. So the block model for Victoria University means that students take one subject for 1 month, intensive deep dive. It also means that the academics have to turn around their assessments in a weekend. So there is no room for sloppiness in terms of process, in terms of integrations. So when the academics are using Brightspace as their LMS, it's a single point of access to all the Turnitin, the data that they wish to see. The Turnitin rankings and assessments come up live in the gradebook. So there's no need to go elsewhere. You can do your overlays, you can have all that information served up in the one place at one time. Having that turnaround time of 1 weekend is a high expectation for students. So it's important that the assessment structures, the assessment strategies and tools also allow the academics to turn it around in that time frame as well. So for VU, they've thought long and hard about the structuring of their block model. It's been so successful across 2 years of COVID that they're actually finding their improvement, the student success rates have actually increased. They took a very architected approach to program design. They were very specific about the way in which they mapped their assessments into that program. And then they were very, very reflective on the way that they would then tweak workflows, use technology to deliver a totally different experience for students. Southern Cross Uni, and I think Murdoch are also looking at other approaches to block models as well. So I think that's an interesting space. You might not go for a block model that's 4 weeks, but I think that the approach to how we better engage with students, particularly those who are first in family, lower socioeconomic groups, how do we better engage with them to build success? So I think that's another trend as well.
I think so. That's really sounds like there's a lot of work that's going into assessment design, especially for authentic learning. And you've talked about VU's block model and everyone's looking at reimagining how they do content. There's a fair bit of conversation around humanizing education. So what does this actually mean and how does this translate into the trends we're seeing?
That's a short question that's actually quite complex. I'd go back to my previous note about student agency. There's kind of two opposing needs here. We demand personalization in so many of our experiences, retail, whatever. But we also need to make sure that these should operate at scale. I go back to the Queensland TAFE and another one of our clients is Queensland Health Fund. They're on a $3 billion business, 15,000 mid-level managers or something, 100,000 plus employees. So how do you maintain a level of personalization at scale in a way which you can apply not to things like retail, but to learning engagements, that personalization? So the humanization thing is a highest order requirement now if we are honest about the way that we engage with students. I go back to a reason for this. Queensland TAFE did a lot of work with the Foundation for Young Australians. They were building out content that was specifically to engage students from lower socioeconomic areas in disciplines such as health, allied health, education, early childhood, and so forth. This was to fill specific workplace and employment opportunities in those regions. They had to be fast, they had to be agile, and they had to maintain a level of quality and engage with students who probably hadn't done too much online learning or further education anyway. Humanisation was absolutely fundamental to engaging with and motivating those students to get them to complete the courses that they began, to fill those job opportunities that were in their locations, and to actually stoke that economic engine in those particular areas. So this was really, really important. So working with the Foundation for Young Australians and looking at the data and research they had done, they looked at particular themes and trends that were emerging. Things like most employees are going to be in more gig economy based or casualized roles. So that meant that there need to be more, I guess, resilience for those employees, for those learners in those spaces. Also, the Foundation for Young Australians research showed that you don't have a dream job anymore. You'll go through a whole variety of jobs across a variety of disciplines. So in fact, what you may be aiming towards is a dream cluster. You might have a variety of clusters. And then all of the assessments and all of the artifacts that you develop builds towards you being able to paint a very detailed picture about your capabilities, your achievements, and your maturation in a whole variety of skill sets and knowledge over time for those clusters. You should then be able to present that. So unless you're able to provide those kinds of more visceral, connected experiences for learners, humanisation is going to always be a little bit further down the road. You'll never really quite achieve it. I think there's one other dimension to humanisation which is really important, and that's a cultural change that often needs to occur within large organisations, so that the language that we use, the approaches that we take, the frameworks that we hang our business on, we hang out the culture of our business on, are more reflective of who we want to be. If I go back to Queensland Health, we were working with them around a training project that was aimed at the middle managers. What they wanted to do was build a series of content pieces that would allow managers, employees to access content at the coffee cart. So let me go up, let me grab some content, 2 flat whites, please. Done. Thanks. And then move on. So it was about that micro learning. Before you could do that, you actually had to engage with the middle managers who maybe hadn't used that kind of approach, certainly didn't have that kind of language in the vocabulary. But until that language and that experience is more commonplace for them, they're not going to have that head and heart evolution to allow that cultural change to occur. And when the cultural change occurs, and just-in-time learning and the expectation that everybody learns all the time starts to occur, then the humanisation can occur from a technology perspective, because you are engaging on a more human individual level with the content in a way that makes sense. And it fits within the organization's strategy and culture.
Wow. So whilst we're talking about humanizing assessment, I think you already talked about the need for student agency. So how might student agency and student voices inform the design and delivery of more authentic assessments?
Have you asked them what they want? Have you thought about co-design with them? Have you thought about the ways in which industry and employees, who will be, in a sense, end users of the content that you create, or they will be consumers of the outputs of undergraduate, postgraduate programs? Have you asked them what they need? We still have this ongoing conversation here in Australia around industry not feeling that students are ready, work ready when they hit workplaces. I think part of that is no doubt true, but I think there's also a a disagreement over what undergraduate and postgraduate studies is about. What I do know is that students who can create knowledge, synthesize research, assess, reflect, and create new knowledge are going to be incredibly valuable in the workplace. Those sorts of skills and those sorts of approaches to thinking about knowledge, creating more knowledge, synthesizing information, working in groups, is exactly the sorts of things that underpin a vibrant, productive knowledge economy. These are the things that we do in undergraduate, postgraduate work. But we don't seem to be able to then map those graduate attributes effectively to what industry needs.
Hmm.
I know work integrated learning, and I think that's one of the questions we were going to get to. Work integrated learning is part of that story, but until we actually have more co-design in the programs, and we think about our academics as subject matter experts in their field, not necessarily subject matter experts as educators, well, that's probably a fairly bold statement from me. Until we get to that point, I think we're going to struggle to marry those two conflicting views together.
I hear you there in the need for more industry practitioners being part of the process of our educational system. And I think it's one of the things RMIT is doing very well is involving industry experts in designing their courses as well as the assessments as well. Just before we get into the learning integrated workspace, just want to piggyback on a response in terms of co-design assessment or learning content with students. Is this actually easy? And what are some approaches for educators that they might actually consider in designing authentic assessments?
I think the concept of co-design comes before everything else. So however we think about assessment in the end, whether we're looking at case studies and peer-based review as part of that process, how do we probably map that? That's a more detailed conversation, but I think we have to really begin with co-design as a first principle view. You talked about RMIT. So I had a contract with RMIT and I was working there for about 12 months with RMIT online. And the way in which the product development framework there operated was very much around co-design with industry. A really obvious example is the work that came from the first courses that they released, which was in Swift programming for iOS devices. That was really a flagship. So you had this powerhouse Apple, biggest company in the world at that point, wanted to have a marquee program. Swift programming was available around the world in various different courses and different institutions. What RMIT did was they took that content, they re-engineered it. They co-designed the courses with local companies in Melbourne. They put drop-ins in place. They had mentors. So the structure of the content and the achievement of outcomes and the mapping across that achievement through the various assessments was within the context of, if you complete this course, you'll be basically a junior programmer for this kind of rate per hour or this kind of wage band. These are the sorts of employees who would take you on. Oh, and by the way, you'll meet some of those employers potentially in your course because they'll be mentoring you. So there was an iterative process around that as well, about approving the course. And what they did in the first course was tuned for the second and the third. The interesting thing there is that course was offered on a one subject basis or as a whole program basis.
Mm.
And the majority of the purchases of that product was in the whole program. People saw this as a way to fundamentally change their trajectory, their professional trajectory. So they were willing to invest, but it also meant that they had to be willing to invest the time over that course as well. So I hope that gives you But
Yeah. I think the summary there is we've got to create the time to actually do it. And doing that requires having a set amount of period to actually do the development of the course, which RMIT spend time in terms of developing a framework, the able methodology, and actually working with industry partners to create a course that actually prepares students for industry outcomes.
so flip that around too, though. That's one approach. That's the traditional approach. Yep. But the tweak there is that's not traditional is true spirit of co-design,
Mm,
working with local companies on the ground to provide starch, expertise, and mentoring within the program.
mm,
Flip that around and go to the Deacon digital approach. And what they've done with some of the master's courses, what you do there is you take, you've got 4 core subjects you do for your masters. The rest is you submitting um, validation and underlying um, explanations around the work that you've done in the workplace and
mm,
how that aligns to those other subjects that you traditionally do. And
mm,
then there's a review process that takes place, and the work that you do professionally uh, in your day-to-day work or projects that you've been engaged in over the last, I think it's 2 years, can be submitted as evidence of your skills and capabilities. Let me do
mm,
that.
mm,
You only pay 500, 600 bucks for that assessment, but then that's a subject done. And you can do that much faster. So you can actually complete say a master's in a particular discipline over a much truncated period of time at a much lower cost. But the majority of that work is based on what you were doing in the workplace. And that has
mm.
to be negotiated then with employees and with the assessors within the university. So just a different approach here.
That's a really interesting approach. And I think you've already moved the conversation into my next question with regards to learning integrated work. So we know that a slightly new concept from work integrated learning, we're now looking at learning integrated work. So how might this begin to shape learning and teaching, particularly how we design authentic assessment?
So on a webinar, we're talking to Ben Oliver, who um, many years ago was talking about earning to learn and learning to learn,
Yeah.
and what part of that journey that you're in. Um, and learning to learn is that traditional approach to education. And then, of course, um, once you're learning, how do you then continue to learn in a way which um, meets your professional goals, maybe your emotional and broader interest needs as well. Everything we learn isn't necessarily tied to our workplace, but the things that we learn can potentially be of great use when we're back in the workplace. So traditionally with work integrated learning, there's been real friction points within that process. Some years ago, I did a review for um, an international, an overseas part of a business school for a university here in Melbourne. And we looked at a platform that was supposed to help connect um, businesses, organizations with students and academics. So students who were doing a particular course needed work placement, but they wanted to do something with, say, VW or BNSF, could use this platform to connect with that, and then academics could place projects up on this platform that could engage both students and those employers. That platform approach was supposed to fix that typical problem of academics having to go back to the same companies, the same well every quarter to find placements. How do you find a greater variety and number of industry-related placements for those students? Whilst it worked well in theory, the practical implementation of that failed because employers and academics weren't working closely enough together to ensure that the outcomes were properly mapped. The employers knew what they were going to get in terms of those graduate placements or those short-term placements on projects. And then the students themselves couldn't easily then articulate the value of that as part of their portfolio of work. I think the work integrated learning component has to play a much more obvious and implicit piece of what we do in undergraduate and postgraduate programs. But I think it also needs a refresh in terms of the approach and the way in which those activities are properly mapped into the program. We go back to co-design again. Quite often, work integrated learning is a series of activities. They're absolutely targeted for industry-based learning, but it's almost being another component that we add in. So I think when we go back to, if I go back to the VU program, the block model that I was telling you about, the way that they architected the learning experience was such that the learning activities, the discussions, the assessments were designed in such a way that they could be delivered, whether it was face-to-face, hybrid,
Fully online.
online, or when COVID hit, fully remote. So the rigor to the assessment, the structure of the program was going to continue to be of the highest level of integrity. In fact, Texas was so impressed by the way that VU had designed that, they actually called that out as a strength of that program. They had no problems with the way in which that had been deployed and the assessments conducted under those early periods of COVID. So if you get it right, there's a whole variety of benefits that flow from having the design with the work integrated learning, the activities and the assessments all in one consistent and properly architected learning journey. So the opportunity here is for work integrated learning to be more a part of the tapestry of the learning that occurs from an undergraduate program through postgraduate. When it is seen as part of that fabric in an integrated way, then the students are looking for those opportunities, employers are seeing the benefits that flow from it, and they're able to provide back to the academics and to the university informed data and information that's going to improve the design of that the next time it's released.
Wow, that's quite interesting, and be very keen to see how this translates into practice in our teaching and learning spaces. Just to wrap up, just looking at the idea behind humanizing education and assessment. The one of the concepts is, how do you actually humanize feedback? So, what would you say are some strategies you can share to support providing actionable feedback for learners?
So feedback can't be like revenge, best served cold. It needs to be still warm. It needs to be linked to what we've just been engaged in, or it needs to be intimately tied to the conversations that flow around and the context around the learning that occurs. So for feedback to be effective, the content, it needs to be properly situated within the context of the learning that's occurring. It needs to be timely, and it needs to be accessible to the learner in terms of their understanding of and ability to springboard from that feedback to improve learning outcomes. Whether you do that through discussions and a whole variety of tools, drop-in sessions, informal group discussions, whatever it is, the immediacy is a non-negotiable. We're going back to the block model again within 24 hours. And they've been tracking content and feedback through the use of intelligent agents and AI across that period, so that the sense of immediacy for feedback is certainly there. The context for that feedback is really important. So the feedback that's coming from the system generated information has to be personalized. So they need to be their name, it needs to relate to what they're doing in this period of time, but it also needs to be built in such a way that it can scale. So one approach that you can take utilizes a little bit of what VU is doing in terms of providing feedback through the use of bots, intelligent agents, to automate some of that feedback. And students aren't bothered that it's system generated, they know it's coming from a bot. But that doesn't matter so much if it's germane to what they're doing, it's contextualized and it's relevant to what they're doing in the main. The next piece for that feedback, though, is then what are the next steps that I could have? So that then starts to think about branched learning pathways, um, different approaches to more content or different experiences being then served up. So feedback, authentic feedback, has to lead to an authentic change in the next set of activities. So that's where technology can really assist with that. But it's also critical that the academics, the professional learning teams, have architected and understand what needs to be provided to learners across a whole variety of different pathways that they're on, given their maturation of skills, development of concepts, and their interests.
Mm.
So that architecture piece is so important. You have to think about those options in a much more networked way, as opposed to the old traditional approach to linear learning.
Excellent. Just to wrap up there, it's my understanding of what you've just said is the immediacy of the feedback, the way it is personalizing the feedback. And what I understood there is how do you make the feedback useful for the student so that they can actually make a change if they need to, that will support their continuous learning. Those are really solid advice or strategies to share. And on that note, I'd like to say a big thank you to Tony for taking time out to share his insights on what the future of assessment is. Very much appreciate your full experiential conversation with this because it's very easy to discuss from a hypothetical, but when you discuss from experience and things you've observed, you've used examples across the sector as part of this conversation. So I'd like to say a big thank you for that.
A pleasure. And really, the value here is in the relationships, the partnerships we have with our clients. And we just learn so much from them on a daily basis. So I have to say, all the hard work is being done by them.
Perfect. Thank you.